In 1953, Jacqueline Lee Bouvier married John Fitzgerald Kennedy in one of those weddings of the century that seem to occur every few years. She was a 24-year-old former debutante who had been working for a Washington newspaper as an inquiring camera girl while prospecting for a husband. He was a freshman senator from Massachusetts with his eyes on the White House. But you know all that, and what ensued. You may even recall the pictures of Jackie's dress, one of the most photographed bridal gowns in history. Jackie was the architect of her own myth, and pretty much everything she wore after her marriage was chosen to enhance it. Her Gallic ancestry, embellished in the retelling, was a central motif. In that regard, her wedding gown was a disappointment to her. According to Kennedy historians, the young Miss Bouvier had lobbied for something svelte and Parisian. But Joseph Kennedy, the groom's father and impresario, overruled her. He was wary of sending the wrong message, decadent foreign glamour. The dress that Jackie got was a chaste confection of ivory silk taffeta with a portrait neckline, a daintily tucked bodice, and a parasol skirt appliqué with frilly rosettes. She wore it with regal aplomb, though her peak may have simmered. In 1961, Mrs. Kennedy's first year in the White House, a writer who interviewed her for the Ladies' Home Journal reported that the gown had been made by a colored woman dressmaker and was not the haute couture. That colored woman dressmaker, Ann Lowe, was in fact a consummate couturier. Her work was admired by Christian Dior and by the legendary costumer Edith Head. Jackie's formidable mother, Janet Auchincloss, was a faithful client. Jackie and her sister, Lee, had both made their Newport debuts in a low dress. Marjorie Merriweather Post, the heiress and philanthropist, Donald Trump bought Mar-a-Lago from her estate, chose a silk fie-robed style, attributed to Lowe, for her portrait by an artist who had painted Queen Elizabeth. Jessica Regan, an associate curator at the Met Costume Institute, compares Lowe to Mainbocher. She was a brilliant example of the American couture tradition, a sculptural designer whose work was a dialogue with the body of the woman who wore it. Lowe's evening and bridal wear was sold coast to coast in upscale department stores. She owned salons at several locations on Madison Avenue. In her heyday, the mid-50s, she claimed that she sold 1,000 gowns a year, grossing $300,000. Her math tends to be inflected by hyperbole. Each gown was an original that required hours of intensive labor. Balenciaga, by comparison, produced about 300 pieces of couture annually. Yet Lowe commuted to the Upper East Side from a ground-floor apartment in Harlem that she shared with her sister Sally, who did the cooking. The same millionaires, who cherished the finesse of her needlework, haggled shamelessly over her prices, and she routinely undercharged them, explaining in interviews that the sheer happiness sewing brought her was its own reward. Retailers profited from her label's cachet but didn't advance the costs of her materials or her labor, and the debts she incurred to suppliers helped ruin her. The Kennedy wedding, for which Lowe also dressed the bridesmaids, was a notable debacle for her. A plumbing disaster in her studio destroyed the gowns shortly before the event. Toiling sleeplessly, she recreated them at her own expense. She never complained to the family. She did, however, indignantly refused to use the service entrance at the Auchincloss farm, threatening to take her work back to New York if it and she weren't ushered through the front door. According to her own chronology, Lowe was born in Clayton, Alabama, in 1898. Her grandmother was a formerly enslaved dressmaker, and her mother specialized in embroidery. When Lowe was 16, her mother passed away suddenly. In her mother's place, Lowe completed a high-profile order from the governor's wife that established her as the new head of the family business. Lowe left her husband and moved to Florida with her son, becoming a live-in dressmaker for a socialite for 10 years. In 1917, she traveled to New York City to attend sewing courses. As the only black student, she was segregated to a separate room away from her peers. She permanently moved to New York City in 1928. Lowe's client network was integral to her success. She became famous among the wealthy American elite for her one-of-a-kind gowns made of fine fabric and handiwork, often evoking floral motifs. Lowe specialized in debutante gowns, and pleased clients would return to her for their wedding dresses. In her research, Museum at Fit curator Elizabeth Way describes the couture quality techniques emblematic of Lowe's craftsmanship, which included gathered tulle and canvas to hold out hems, lace seam bindings, hand-sewn organza facings, and weights to promote proper hang. In 1950, Lowe opened her standalone business, Ann Lowe's Gowns, in New York City. In 1953, Ann Lowe was chosen to create the dresses for the entire bridal party of Jacqueline Bouvier's wedding to Senator John F. Kennedy. The wedding gown received publicity, but the press did not credit Lowe at the time, referring to her as a colored dressmaker. Although she excelled at dressmaking and designed for an elite clientele, Lowe was paid less than white designers for her custom design work. Upon the death of her son and business partner in 1958, she had difficulty making ends meet, ultimately declaring bankruptcy in 1962. An anonymous benefactor, thought to be Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, paid off the debt Lowe had incurred from medical and business expenses. No longer society's best-kept secret, as the Saturday Evening Post called her, Lowe is now recognized as a pioneering African-American couturier. Her pieces are preserved in renowned museum collections including the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Museum of the City of New York, and the Museum at Fit.